Hello, Telltale again. In our short story month, we're doing nothing but short
Yeah.
stories. We read all short stories in November, and we're putting all the videos up for December.
Yes.
So this is number 2. We just finished talking about "And All Cats Are Gray" by Andre Norton. This one is "The Roads Must Roll" by Robert A. Heinlein.
Yes.
I finally got her to go all the way back. Well, you read Nightfall and you read Who Goes There?
Yes.
John Campbell and Isaac Asimov.
Yes.
But if you don't read Heinlein, you don't know science fiction. There's a reason why he's generally called the Grand Master of science fiction.
Okay.
He is brilliant. He was really the best writer in the Campbell area of Astounding Magazine during what they call the Golden Age of the 1940s. Golden Age started in 1939 and lasted till John Campbell got involved in Dianetics.
Okay.
And
Poor
went
guy.
downhill from there.
Oh well. Oh well.
But the 1940s were just this incredible period of creativity in science fiction. And the best craftsman, I think, of all the writers of that period was Robert Heinlein.
Okay.
And The Roads Must Roll is one of his earliest. I might be wrong, but I think it was 1940 that it was published.
I think
He had
so.
only published a couple of stories before that. And the basic synopsis is you have the United States where all the transportation has been recreated into moving roads, like
Giant
conveyor belts.
conveyor belts, essentially.
And Heinlein,
Because of an energy crisis.
Heinlein postulates how this could actually maybe work. It actually couldn't work, but he comes up with something where you have this series of conveyors going at different speeds, and people can
hundreds
step
of
from
miles
one
per
to
hour,
another.
though. Like 200
Yeah.
miles per hour. That's what throws me off. How is a person supposed to step onto this platform and not just get catapulted
Well,
off?
because you're not going from a dead stop onto it.
Yeah.
You're stepping up.
You're stepping
through
onto, like, the
conveyor
progressive.
belts,
But
so you're
still,
only-
I feel like even just coming... If you've ever been on the fast walkways at, like, O'Hare, where
Yeah.
you step onto the platform and, like, even then, you get a jolt, like, it's easy for older people to just...
Or if you've ever been skiing and had to go up with
one
the
of
rope,
those... Yeah.
my arm sockets are still hurting from that
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, like, it's just not a It's practical for the speed, but it is not practical to get on and off of, especially if you're a certain age. Like, older people often fall on those. They are a hazard. A lot of people will avoid them.
But Heinlein
Yeah.
was smart enough, and remember, this is 1940. We didn't have interstates. We didn't have O'Hare Airport.
Yeah.
We
had
trains
and buses.
and buses, but
and
that's
some cars.
it. We didn't have the population explosion that we've had since then.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't have the transportation infrastructure like we have today.
Mm-hmm.
But Heinlein at that time sat down to think about how such an infrastructure would affect our whole society. And he writes this story, the whole nation is dependent on these rolling roads because that's how
Kind of
everybody
like we
gets
are
everywhere.
with the internet. Oh.
Well, but even
Sort
more
of.
so, there's a parallel with what happened in the 1980s.
Oh.
Heinlein postulates that the nation is dependent on these roads, and the people who maintain the roads decide we have the power. We're going to start making demands because, of course, their working conditions are deplorable. They're down underneath, getting full of oil, and
Yeah.
they
live in the
something goes
underground,
wrong,
essentially.
they have to just drop everything and fix it. It's not nice.
Yes. And
So-
they're indoctrinated into a very cult-like atmosphere because of their
Yeah.
position, which is kind of partially why they kind of shift
Right.
a little bit, where they're like, well, if we're so important, then maybe we can start, making demands and make some things happen.
Right. So they see this and they organize and form their union and start to make demands and they shut down part of the roads.
And, like, we're talking hard stop.
Yeah.
So people, like, fall off and get flung.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of casualties.
Mm-hmm. So the main character of the story goes in to put an end to this and get these people back to work and get everything back to the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say this was brilliant back then, at a time when you didn't have O'Hare Airport type airports, you didn't have the major interstates and the big traffic tie-ups like you have in LA or Chicago or New York. Heinlein was seeing that this could happen, and sure enough, in the early 1980s, the air traffic controllers were being overworked,
Yep.
making mistakes. They wanted better working conditions, they wanted better wages, they wanted more people hired, and they went on strike. And President Reagan fired every one of them for going on strike in order to resolve
executive
the situation.
order. You're all fired.
It was the roads must roll.
It was.
Heinlein wrote the story in 1940, and
Yeah.
it came true in, like, was it 1982 or something like that?
Yep. 40 years later,
Yeah.
they took over. But yeah. And the world pretty much shut down.
Yeah.
That
And
shut
so
everything down.
I think despite the kind of ridiculous technology situation that
Yeah,
Heinlein
this
came up with,
technology's not that great, but
despite that,
it's almost
he
diesel
saw
punk.
something that really came to pass. He saw how important transportation technology was going to become to us, and the fact that the workers would need to stand up for themselves, and that they would probably be put down because it was too important to allow a bunch of rabble-rousers to bring it to a halt.
Yes, and I think one of the things that I really appreciated about this story, too, is it has a huge focus on corporatism.
Yeah.
The main character's entire thought process is very corporatist. Everything is he is literally a workaholic. He enjoys being a workaholic through the whole thing. His wife is trying to get a hold of him, and he is just putting her off and having his secretary put her off and do all this stuff. He has a representative from Australia come that he's supposed to be showing around. He just shoves him off to the side when the crisis happens. Like, no thought given, like, to care for this guy or make sure he's actually at a safe enough space. He just leaves him at a station. Literally just leaves him there and says, "Stay put." And then goes and deals with this whole crisis, and then it's so interesting because he is literally the epitome of what corporatists want our capitalism to become. Is to have these workers who are basically brainwashed and kind of cult-like for the cause, not necessarily for the brand, essentially.
Yeah.
Instead of for each other and their conditions. Like, basically to work until they're just run down. And I think we have a terrible issue with that in a lot of capitalist societies. Because corporations want to get something for nothing in a lot of respects. And sometimes it is at the detriment of your workers.
That.
Yeah, even Joe Schmo wants that.
Yeah.
Yeah, free would be great.
But here's the really interesting thing about this story. Robert Heinlein is very famous for being a libertarian in his politics. This story couldn't possibly be more pro-government.
Yes, it really is, because the roads are actually government run exclusively. And not even local government run. It's like federal government run.
People are standing up and rebelling against the system in order to assert their individuality, and Heinlein has them put down. Totally against his later political beliefs.
Yeah.
The libertarians believed in individualism and wanted government out of the way.
Yeah, so it's interesting that not every story has 10% of truth of what the author believes. Sometimes it's just an interesting conflict, an interesting storyline, and it's outside of their box of
and I think
system.
it's too simple to just put a Heinlein into the libertarian box and say that's he believes the party line. He was every individual person has their own individual interests and thoughts and will depart from the party line in certain ways, and I think this shows really the complexity of Heinlein's ideas. Because
Yes.
later on, he wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, which was one of the pivotal books for the whole counterculture movement in the 60s,
Yep.
which is generally seen as liberal, totally opposite of libertarian. He's a complicated writer and a complicated thinker.
Yeah.
He's not so simple. You can't just peg him into a hole and leave it there. And this story is definitely indicative of that.
Yeah, and I think it's cool that a lot of science fiction writers, especially him, tend to kind of pull these ideas that are very, like, hypothetical situation. They're not afraid to ask the what ifs. And have really hard things happen, and have really scary things happen, and have interesting conflicts, political or otherwise.
Well,
and I am
and that
appreciating
was
that
the
a
cool
lot.
thing about science fiction in the 1940s is it was so under the radar.
Yeah.
No, there was
You could get away with
maybe-
everything.
maybe 10,000 people in the world were reading this stuff, and nobody else knew anything about this when at the time it was published.
Yes.
So science fiction could question a lot of things and get away with it. Even to the point where there's a very famous science fiction story that basically describes a government-run project to create an atomic bomb at the time when the government was running Project Manhattan, creating the atomic bomb. To the point where
Fiction.
John Campbell,
Ooh.
the editor, he had
Some people giving him
the
phone
government
calls.
come in.
The CIA
and,
says, "How did you know?" And he's
start
like, "No, what?"
questioning him. Where they were getting their information, because it was a top secret project at the time. This was 1943. But that's what science fiction could do at that time. They had that power because nobody was controlling it. There wasn't a lot of money behind it. There wasn't Hollywood behind it. It wasn't commercial. It was very much under the radar. And so they could write what they wanted, and they wrote some very, very brilliant stuff like The Roads Must Roll.
Yep. And so if anybody wants to know, all of these stories, this is one compilation that I picked all of these out. This is the Adventures in Time and Space, edited by Raymond James Healy and J. Francis McComas.
Which is one of the earliest anthologies of science fiction, published in the late 1940s.
So all of the science fiction stories we are going to be doing from here on out, with the exception of All Cats Are Gray,
Yeah.
in this series, are actually ones I pulled from this compilation. There are many compilations. Greg has many other different ones that have at least some of these stories in them, or all of the stories we're going to be talking about.
I have all those stories in some other book somewhere. So
Yeah.
I've actually never owned a copy of that book. I checked it out from the library when I was a teenager and read a lot of it. But since then, I've bought a lot of anthologies, like the Great Science Fiction Stories has a lot of that stuff in.
Yep.
And so that's where I'm reading my copies. But
Yeah, so this is a nice compilation. He got this for me as a gift, and I really appreciate it just because it has some really great literature in it. And when we talked about wanting to do short stories, this was actually my go-to, just because it has so many great pieces of work, especially ones that I hadn't read yet, and I'm still trying to get into a lot of classic science fiction. So this is a really great compilation if you want to start your short stories pursuits. I have yet to read a bad one in this guy.
Yeah,
Such a
and
great piece.
I don't think it's currently in publication, but there's a lot of used copies out there on the internet. I didn't have to spend a huge amount of money to get that.
Yeah, so this is a pretty reasonably priced compilation if you want to start in science fiction, want to get into some actual good short stories, because that's one of the issues we've talked about before, is that when it comes to short stories, people don't always know how to find the good ones.
Yeah, there's
These
a
are
lot
good
of bad
ones.
short stories out there.
These are good ones.
Mostly.
Good ones. I have yet to read a bad one.
And of course, all of these,
Yeah.
everything in these they're chosen by Isaac Asimov, who lived through those years and really knew what everybody was excited about at that time, and pulled them together into these books.
Yeah, and this one's a Random House publication, so Random House is pretty easily accessible.
Yeah.
But yeah, so if you guys want a good place to start with quality science fiction short stories, those are some recommendations we have for compilations if you're looking to start somewhere. And yeah, Roads Must Roll. That was a really good one.
Yep.
I did like it. It felt more diesel punk than science fiction to me. Well, I guess it's kind of both. Like, diesel punk is a subgenre of science fiction in a lot of respects, but
Yeah, but it's hard to. I mean, it's like
he
the
doesn't give you a lot of
original-
detail to know.
The original steampunk is H.G. Wells, but it isn't steampunk because he lived in the Victorian times.
Yeah,
He was living and writing in that and thinking about technology.
Yeah,
And so it's
what could be
it's
done.
the original thing, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
And the same with Robert Heinlein. He was writing from the perspective of the technology of his day. And so, yeah, today we look back on it and call it diesel punk. But
yeah.
it really was
Its own current events,
scientific thinking of the time.
contemporary science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, also do not carry this in your purse because this thing's a
It'll
brick. I was carrying it around to read it while I was on Thanksgiving break. My shoulders are paying for it. So
Maybe there's an ebook of it.
Yeah, if you could find an ebook of it, that'd
That'll
probably
be
be.
lighter.
Yeah, some of these are in Project Gutenberg too. So
Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah.
could find a lot of really good stuff on there for science fiction, but you know, some of the
Like all cats are,
yeah.
and all cats are gray.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all cats are gray. And man, there's just a lot. There's a lot of old magazines that they just pulled stories from and put on
Yeah,
there.
I've noticed that even stuff that I know is copyrighted, you can find on archive.org PDFs of the original magazines and download them and read them. And nobody's, I mean, it's been out there for years and nobody's bothering them.
Well, now you just
So-
ratted them out. No. I'm kidding.
But I think that's a
Yeah.
great resource because the average person can't go and collect all those old pulp magazines. Most of them have disintegrated. They were newsprint.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's just a very few
They're lining dresser drawers now.
expensive copies that some people have taken care of. And that's where you get them. Or, of course, the anthologies. But
Yeah.
if you want the original magazines, well, good luck.
Yeah.
The easiest way is to go to archive.org and download a PDF or EPUB copy of it. And like I say, I know the stories are copyrighted still, but nobody's going after archive.org for that. So
Yeah. Good on you.
yeah,
But yeah.
that's a great resource.
So that's really all I had to say for Roads Must Roll.
Me too. It's a great story.
It was a good story. Technology is a little impractical, but
Yeah.
I enjoyed it still. I like a good vigilante story every once in a while. It's kind of fun. So, all right. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. We will see you next time. Bye.